Hi, welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm back in Las Vegas at the Luxor Resort Casino, and you see just behind me is the famous obelisk, and then just behind that is the Sphinx. And so this feature today, I want to focus on a comparison of Egypt in a variety of spaces around the world. So let's begin this video feature here comparing Egypt's from different theme spaces. And as we begin this tour of Egypt and the resultant forms in what we call Egyptomania, I wanted to just ask you, why are certain forms or symbols chosen for these representations of Egypt? And I've mentioned in some other videos that at one point the San Francisco airport did a really interesting overview of Egyptomania, and they talked about the revival of Egyptian style in furniture and all sorts of household decor. And as you can see here, they pointed out in one of their plaques that part of this fascination with ancient Egypt leads to exoticism. And this is always an issue for anthropologists like myself, is when something gets represented in another form, how does it get exoticized? And I think in that sense, we begin to talk about theming as its own form of imagination. And I found many examples on the internet of places that will help you theme a party using Egyptian narratives. And you can see all the forms here, related to costumes, related to decor, related to certain props and so forth. So this goes back to that initial question I asked you, why are certain symbols or forms chosen? As part of the imagination, I found this interesting years ago while in Copenhagen. It was represented here in a sandcastle, and I think from the get-go we realized that there's something incredibly iconic, almost immediately knowable about Egypt in terms of our imagination. And certainly it comes to no surprise to us that we see representations of Egypt in theme parks. This particular ride at an adventure amusement park in the United Kingdom. And you can see what are the associations chosen for the theming. Another example, Pharaoh's Adventure Park, which is now closed, but was in Redlands, California, and today is a non-themed water park. They relied very heavily on this sort of theming, and you could look at this image here and say it's quite over the top, and you might start to begin to wonder if there's an essence to Egypt that is being remade or reused that maybe would not be considered appropriate to people from the culture. Now, interestingly enough, mentioning that, there's a park called Cleo Park, presumably named after Cleopatra, in Egypt, and you can see here their particular slogan. And so maybe it's no surprise then that we see the moving back of particular moments of Egyptian culture from Egypt itself in terms of Egyptomania back into the West, and then back again into Egypt. And you can see the theming here is very much extensive in terms of what they've represented here, even the pyramid itself being part of a water ride. And in terms of other examples of the reconstruction of Egypt in our imagination in theme parks, we can go to Parc Astrique, which I haven't yet visited in France. You can see that they focus on this idea of time travel, and they're very specific about the time period that they're referencing in terms of their Egyptian themeland. So I found this to be quite interesting in terms of that level of specificity, in contrast to, say, what we saw in the water park in Redlands. And I encourage you to watch my other video on Egyptomania 1, where I focus primarily on Universal Studios Singapore, which for me was one of the most exciting representations of Egypt in a theme park form. And I was thinking about, after my visit, how this invokes senses of the past and history and certain associations in our minds, like mystery, and also the idea of adventure. And this probably goes along with the fact that there's an intertwining of this form of Egyptian theming with the popular imagination of Egypt that we've also received from various tales and stories over time. Certainly most recently the series of mummy movies, which are represented in a variety of theme park forms that I'll focus on. Of course, Universal being the primary place where these particular narratives of Egypt in the popular imagination have been reconstructed. What is fascinating to me as well in this look at Egypt, to go back to the initial point, is what are the symbols, iconic forms that are represented? Can we then create a cataloging of these in our minds, or perhaps more analytically to do a proper anthropological analysis, and then come to some understandings about what this says about the allure in terms of Egyptomania, the allure of Egypt in our minds, in our consciousness. And I think this would certainly be a task for us to undertake in the future. Now, I just mentioned Universal Studios Hollywood. They have a much smaller theme land. In fact, it's not really a theme land in contrast with the Singapore version. It's basically one ride, and as you can see, buttressed up against the Starbucks. They do make an effort to theme the queue area and so forth, but what was curious to me about this representation of Egypt was that it was only based on and dependent on the various mummy movies. And again, we would ask questions about why that form, why that representation of Egypt, and how does that diminish maybe the possibility to understand a greater depth of Egyptian culture in terms of looking at these representations. And I was recently thinking about how appropriate it is to have all these hieroglyphs represented. And in a sense, hieroglyphs, if you thought about using a script or a language that we understood like English, there's less mystery associated with that language. And in the case of hieroglyphs, they are pictorial, so they very much are akin to being used in thematic ways. Now, I have to focus also on the museal context of looking at Egypt. And if you have been to the Brooklyn Museum, looking at my photos here, you might also have realized that in addition to having this incredible collection, one of the largest collections of Egyptian archaeological finds and recreations in the world, there's also this construction in the imagination here, and you see it in this Gloria Steinem quote in terms of talking about things like empowerment and mystery and so forth. We also see Egypt represented in the case of Harrods in London. And perhaps we're more familiar with Harrods because of the tragic accident of Dodi Fayed and Princess Diana, but I do encourage you to look in the future to look into some of the constructions here, and particularly go to William Mitchell's site that I've listed for you here. He has an excellent discussion of the inspirations behind the Egyptian theming, and this may surprise you because I feel sometimes cultural critics are suggesting that someone just slaps the stuff together and it is what it is and so forth. In fact, I think you can say there's much more to the Egyptian theming in a case like Harrods here than what appears to be on the surface. Now, in contrast to Harrods with this representation of Egypt, we may look at a chain like the popular Cheesecake Factory, which many people are familiar with. If you read a number of online accounts of Cheesecake Factory, people have discussed what they call a neo-Egyptian theme. And if we look at the word neo, in addition to it meaning new, it presumes that something has been represented to us through multiple iterations. So filtering and filtering and filtering into our consciousness. And I think if you call this neo-Egyptian, what you see in this version is something many versions removed. And I won't say from the original, but many versions removed from previous constructions of Egypt in our imagination. And of course, if we're talking about Egypt, we would have to focus on the Luxor in Las Vegas. If there's one site on the planet that has aided and perhaps abetted in the construction of Egypt in our minds or consciousness, it is the Luxor in Las Vegas. And I've mentioned in previous videos that the theming of the Luxor over time certainly has changed. What is interesting to me is a concept of what I would introduce to you called culture sampling. And the notion of culture sampling is that we have various cultural forms in the world, they're recreated for us. It's this notion of remixing, remaking, recreating that culture in various versions, and then recrafting that in another place. So in the case of a place like the Luxor in Las Vegas, we can talk about notions of culture and how those are taken over time, whether they're material forms or performative forms, and those lead to new imaginations and new expressions of, in this case, Egypt. Now, with these new versions in mind, let me suggest something maybe controversial, that theming can specifically be seen as a testing ground for ideas. Back in the day, well before I visited Luxor, they used to have a Nile boat ride. That is now gone. And so we can think about that recreation of place and performance. The lobby area used to have much more extensive Egyptian theming, that also has now disappeared. And so what I would suggest is that instead of seeing theming from the perspective of the critic who simply dismisses it as inauthentic rubbish, we see it actually as a testing ground of culture. So as culture is sampled and remixed and remade in new places and new forms, we ask ourselves, why did some forms sustain themselves and why did other forms like King Tut's chariot or this mural, which has now also disappeared from the Luxor, why have some forms persisted and remained, and why have other forms disappeared? Are there marketing reasons behind this? Are there cultural, demographic reasons? What can we attribute to these changes? You could see even the rooms, the toiletries in the rooms in the Luxor used to also have this theming. And I think something has been lost in the years that have passed since some of this theming was present within the Luxor. It's another example. You could see the hieroglyphs and also the bedspread have this theming, as does the furniture, which might remind us back of that SFO exhibit on Egypt and also of the Neo-Egypt that we talked about in terms of the Cheesecake Factory. And as we address some of these changes, I would ask us, do we note a waning of particular history of this Egyptomania in the U.S. As evidence at the Luxor with some of the changes? You'll recall in some other video features about the Luxor and the popular aspects of Egypt, I posed some questions about the theming and the transformation of the theming and what's been called the de-theming. And as you can see here, the former Luxor COO talked about how they didn't want to be the British Museum, and the outside was good, but the inside didn't quite work. And I find this to be quite interesting. And in fact, today, if you look at the contemporary version of a Luxor in 2015, it almost seems to me like Egypt has become an afterthought. And what is dominating in terms of the murals and the video screens is the popular culture, that culture of our imagination, which maybe we would say is very far removed from any sense of Egyptian culture. So I hope you enjoyed this video feature today here in Las Vegas, as well as in other spaces from around the world. Please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.